Now, most BCBAs that I know don't supervise from a distance by choice. But the realities of the field, remote sessions, competing priorities, large caseloads, and high turnover, all of these mean that a lot of supervision happens at a distance, even if it's technically in person. Here's what that can look like in practice. An RBT says, "Yeah, we're still running the plan, but I just skipped that part." He doesn't like it. Or they're helping with a parent concern by offering advice. Or the data says a target was mastered, but the implementation looks different than what was designed. They're not doing anything they believe is wrong, but they're making decisions they weren't trained or authorized to make. That's what ethical drift looks like. And it usually doesn't show up as a red flag. It shows up as a slow shift in what normal looks like. This course is about helping you see the shift sooner and giving you a way to respond clearly, constructively, and consistently. What we're not doing here is memorizing the code. What we're doing here is learning how to supervise RBTs in real world conditions when you can't be everywhere, when other professionals are involved, and when expectations are muddy, and even those times when the systems around you aren't helping. You're going to leave this course with a 5-step clear framework that you can use immediately to spot ethical drift early, understand what's contributing to that ethical drift, make the invisible visible, coach with clarity, and put systems in place that reduce drift in the first place. This course is for supervisors who want to do more than just check a box. It's for those of us who want to supervise ethically by design, not by reaction. Before we get into it, let's cover some housekeeping things. First, I'm Christy Wilson, a BCBA supervisor and creator of the Ascend RBT assessment system. But more importantly, I've been in the trenches. I've supervised staff across school, clinic, home, and remote settings. I've had incredible RBTs, and I've had moments where I realized something had gone off track and I didn't catch it soon enough. Over time, I stopped asking, why didn't they follow the plan? And I started asking, what was reinforcing that drift? What system let that happen? And how can I change it? That question led me here, to this course, to a system that I now use and teach to help BCBAs support ethical performance before it becomes a crisis. This training isn't about pointing fingers. It's about giving you the tools to supervise in ways that prevent drift, support clarity, and grow RBTs into confident professionals. Ethical concerns in supervision aren't theoretical anymore. They're showing up in the data, in fieldwork violations, and in burnout numbers. Recent research tells us that supervisory drift is a top contributor to ethical violations. RBTs are often performing outside their scope, and no one's catching it. Supervisors are overworked, undersupported, and unsure how to address this subtle stuff. And the standard 40-hour training, it's just not enough. But here's the good news. You can catch drift early, you can design better systems, and you can do it without adding more stress. That's what this course is for. By the end of this course, you're going to know how to spot early signs in ethical drift. We're also going to look at how to uncover the reinforcement systems that are driving that drift, replace ambiguity with clear, teachable expectations. Align the environment that you're in so that the ethical behavior is reinforced and not just required. And build in feedback systems that prevent burnout and support ethical fluency over time. But more importantly, you're going to leave with a system that you can implement right away, plus tools and checklists and real-world strategies to back it up. This isn't about checking that CEU box either. It's about making supervision more ethical, more sustainable, and more aligned with what we all want: safe, effective, compassionate care. So this is an asynchronous course designed to be taken at your own pace with pause and reflect moments throughout. Here's how to get the most of it. Use your workbook. It is packed with checklists and case vignettes, scripts, and planning tools tied directly to the content. Use the reflection prompts. You're going to be asked questions that connect the content to your setting and what you're doing every day. Jot down your answers or talk them out with somebody else. Engage with the comment section. Learning sticks best when it's collaborative. If something clicks, share it. If something's unclear, ask. At the end, you're going to take a quiz and complete the CEU form to receive your certificate by email. You're here because you care. You're not taking this course because you failed as a supervisor. You're here because you refuse to settle for good enough. This training is designed to support you, to challenge you, and to help you lead with clarity and confidence. It's not about perfection. It's about building systems that make ethical behavior easier to do and harder to drift from. So let's get started. So here's one of those reflection moments. Have you ever had an ethical issue come up in RBT supervision that caught you completely off guard? And what made it hard to see at first, do you think? We've all had these situations come up, so think about yours and jot it down. We're going to go back and reflect on this later. Now, most ethical issues don't start with a violation. They start when something small shifts and no one notices the shift. Maybe an RBT skips a step because it helps the session go smoother, or accepts direction from a teacher, or reassures a caregiver in a way that oversteps their role. These moments don't look unethical. They look helpful. And that's exactly the problem. According to our ethics code, RBTs must implement behavior plans exactly as written, right? Deviations require clinical judgment, which must come from the behavior analyst. But the code also says that it's our responsibility to supervise ethically, to ensure that they can do this with confidence and clarity. And if we're not watching for drift, we're silently reinforcing it. Here's another reflection question. When was the last time that you caught an RBT doing something helpful, but that was technically outside of their role? Now let's take this a step further and look at what ethical drift actually looks like in day-to-day supervision. To really see ethical drift, we have to get more specific. There are 4 types of ethical drift to watch for. Each one carries different risks, and each one requires a different supervisory response. So we're going to walk through them with real-world examples, potential outcomes, and questions that you can ask to address the drift before it becomes a violation. When the RBT changes how they implement procedures, adding, skipping, reordering, modifying without input from the supervisor, that's what we're talking about here with procedural drift. Common examples otherwise can look like reducing trials from 10 to 5 because it was too hard, using naturalistic reinforcement instead of programmed scheduled reinforcement, or changing the task analysis because they already get it. Now with this one, have you ever heard your RBT say something like this? Well, hey, I told mom we should just stop using extinction. It's too hard. Or maybe they've said, I think we should drop that goal. He doesn't really like it. Both of these are examples of role boundary drift. More specifically defined, when the RBT takes on responsibilities outside of their scope, like decision-making, family guidance, and interpreting progress. Other common examples might include recommending schedule changes to parents, or modifying goals based on what seems easier, or even giving advice about discipline strategies. All of these are outside of that role of our RBT. Now, delegation drift is where our RBT follows instructions from someone other than the supervising BCBA. That could be a parent, a teacher, another provider. Maybe you've heard comments like this. Well, the teacher told me not to use the visuals, so I didn't. Or, mom said she prefers when we don't prompt, so I've just been backing off. Other examples of this could look like following a teacher's suggestion to just do quiet work, or letting a caregiver remove a demand or reinforce behavior contrary to the behavior plan, or even abandoning protocol because a non-BCBA said to do so. Our fourth form of drift can sound like this. I stopped doing that part of the plan and the whole team was relieved. Or they really liked that I didn't push that demand today. This is when our RBT receives positive reinforcement for behavior that technically drifts from the plan. For example, praise from caregivers or approval from staff or easier sessions. It can also look like skipping the extinction process and being told, wow, today went so well. Or cutting sessions short and being thanked for being flexible. Another example could look like avoiding a tough procedure and hearing, oh my gosh, the client had such a good day. Have you ever had these things happen to you? Now take a moment to reflect. Think of a recent situation where drift may have occurred. Which of those four types of drift do you think it might fit into best? And what support or training can you think of right now that may have prevented it? Once you see it, maybe you'll see in a different light. Now, each of these categories represents behavior drift, not just ethical theory. So they later develop slowly and often go unseen until a larger issue surfaces. Sellers et al. In 2016 remind us that the supervisor is ethically responsible for ensuring all delegated tasks are appropriate and understood. So now that we've seen what drift could look like, let's dig into a few realistic short case vignettes to make this even more concrete. This is so important, you guys, that we are able to spot these things early so that we can address them, because it is our responsibility as a supervisor to constantly be assessing how our RBT is and what they're doing and the appropriateness of it. So here's our first scenario. An RBT is running a hygiene routine task analysis in the clinic. You notice during an observation that they're skipping the prompt to wet hands step and going right to the soap. You ask about it, and they say, well, he always gets frustrated with that step. It slows things down, so I just move past it. What type of drift does this sound like? If you said procedural drift, you are right on with this one. Now, in this situation, how would you help the RBT understand why skipping a step, even with good intent, can undermine outcomes? What kind of strategies might you think of to try? Here is something that you could say in a situation like this. Try it on for size. Thanks for noticing the client's frustration. It is such important data for us to have. Now let's go back and look at why that step is there and how we can make it less aversive without skipping it. I want to make sure that we protect the plan while adjusting it for the learner. What do you think about that response? See if you can come up with one similar to that you can give a try in a situation that you've encountered that might be an example of procedural drift. All right, our next scenario. We've got a parent training session going on. You learn that your RBT told the caregiver that they should just ignore the whining, even though that behavior hasn't been formally targeted in our behavior plan. When you ask your RBT about this, they explain to you, it wasn't a big deal. I thought that's what you'd want them to do. With this example, what kind of drift does that sound like? Role boundary drift. You got it. The RBT is giving feedback, giving suggestion, giving treatment examples, or offering treatment that is outside of their role of the RBT. That is a conversation for the BCBA to be having with the parents. So think, what system would you put in place to help your RBT feel confident not answering caregiver questions outside of their scope? What kinds of routines or rituals or systems can you set up in the environment to catch these things happening? You could also try responding to the situation as it's come up with something like this. It's great that you're trying to support the family's consistency. Thank you so much. It is important. At the same time, giving behavior advice, even informally, can cross into decisions that need to come from our behavior plan. Let's work out a way to address questions like this when they come up. I'd like you to be able to redirect them back to supervision so that we can figure it out together as a team, what works best and how to guide our parents, clinically when things like this come up. What do you think about that? So there we offer the feedback to the RBT and kind of we want them to align with us, to work together with us instead of feeling like they need to make decisions on their own. Here is another scenario. This is one for those who work in a school setting. Maybe you've heard this happen before. In a school-based setting, the RBT stops running discrete trials mid-session and switches to a sorting activity. You're observing and you ask why. And your RBT responds, the teacher told me that the table work was making him anxious and asked me to do something easier. What type of drift does this sound like? This is totally an example of delegation drift. The feedback of changing the programming came directly from that teacher, not from the supervising BCBA. So in this situation, how could you approach clarifying roles and responsibilities in the school setting where RBTs most often get pressured by providers? What are some strategies that you maybe have thought about doing or have done to help this drift? Here's an example of something that you could, or a way to start the conversation with your RBT to approach this further. You could say, thank you so much for honoring the teacher's concerns. It's really important that we are able to work together as a team and that everybody has a voice in the decision making, especially when we're in the classroom setting of the teachers. At the same time, it's really important that we're able to make the clinical adjustments needed coming from our treatment plan. So next time, let's pause, bring it back to the team before changing the session so that we can stay within our roles and support the client most ethically to make progress, which is really what we're all here for. So we're able to identify like, yes, great. Thank you for helping. Everybody's voice is important. And we need to do this together. We need to work together. We need to make sure that clinical decisions are being made ethically and directed through the team ethically as well. So here's an example of those of us in the clinic setting. You notice that the RBT is reinforcing problem behavior with escape. When confronted, the RBT explains, I just gave him a break instead of using extinction. He calmed down really fast, and the parent was so happy about it. The team told me that they liked how calm the session was. All right, what kind of drift is this one? You got it. Reinforcement shift drift. The reinforcement is coming from the parents, from the team, from the quieter session instead of how it was built to be in the system. So when we have these examples, how can we reshape our reinforcement contingencies around ethical behavior so that our RBTs are recognized for fidelity and not just flexibility? This is such an important thing to think about in the grand scope of our treatment planning. One way that you can start to enter that conversation with your RBT could look like, hey, I really appreciate your awareness and your responsiveness to your client's emotions. Now let's look at how we can honor that compassion with sticking to the plan. I also want to talk about how we can shift team feedback to reinforce our implementation and not just the calmness. Because what we're doing here is a full wraparound. Yes, we want the calmness and we definitely want to reinforce the calmness, but it's important that we're reaching that calmness through the implementation of our treatment plan, which is how we're mapping out how to get there. All right, so we've been through the school, we've been in the clinic. Now let's look at a telehealth scenario. You're reviewing a session recording from a home-based telehealth session. During a manding program, the RBT prompts the learner with a yes-no choice rather than using the targeted manned prompt hierarchy. The parent is present and nods approvingly. You follow up and ask about the change. The RBT says, it's just easier that way. It keeps them from getting upset and the parent prefers it. I didn't think it was that big of a deal since we weren't running a full session today anyways. Now here's a tricky one. What types of drift does this represent? This example represents both a procedural drift and a reinforcement shift drift. So we've got the change in the way that the procedure is being run, not discussed with the BCBA, as well as the reinforcement coming from the parent, being a product or a part of why the decision was made. So when we have scenarios like this, what systems can we put in place during our remote sessions to detect and address procedural drift more effectively, especially when you're not present in real time? We're always thinking about this and how to be on top of it in telehealth. One way that you can enter this conversation and get it started is by saying something like, hey, thank you so much for explaining that. I know that the telehealth platform brings unique challenges, especially when parents are involved live, which is great. We want our parents to be involved. Our treatment plan is in place to support consistency even in the shorter sessions. So let's take a look at it again and talk through what changes are clinically appropriate and how we can coach our caregivers in a way that keeps you in role and on plan. Let's work on this together. What do you think? So this one, it still validates like, hey, you are doing great meeting the parent where the parent's at. Let's figure out how we could do it together to continue clinically and in a clinically appropriate way and ethically to guide our treatment and invite the parent to be a part of it. So after looking at examples of these different types of drift, let's pause and think about what it means for our supervision systems. Because if this drift is happening, it's not always about the RBT. It's often about what our systems aren't catching. Drift is almost never about motivation. It's about shaping, reinforcement, visibility. As Donovan et al. In 2019 note, ethical concerns often increase under high workloads, unclear expectations, or inconsistent support. Sounds like a festering petri dish for ethical concerns, right? This means, though, that our RBTs may be trying to reduce friction or please their caregivers, or maybe they believe that they're making the right call, or they just may not know that they're drifting at all. Our job as supervisors isn't just to correct, it's to build systems that clarify. If supervision only happens on paper or only when a problem emerges, drift becomes the norm. And let's be clear, drift is not your fault, it's not my fault, but it is our responsibility to catch it. And as Kranick et al. In 2023 highlight in their review, effective supervision must be proactive, observable, and systematically supported. And now that you're trained to see drift, let's move on to our next step. Locate the cause. We're going to look at what's actually driving the drift in your context so that you can help fix at the source. Now that you can spot drift when it shows up, it's time to look at what's behind it. So this step is all about identifying what's driving those behaviors so that we don't just fix the behavior, but the whole system that is maintaining it. Ethical drift doesn't happen in a vacuum. If we want to stop the drift from repeating, we have to understand what's reinforcing it, whether intentionally or not intentionally reinforcing it. So this is going to mean stepping back and looking at the full contingency context around your RBT's decision-making. Ethical drift isn't usually the result of an RBT choosing to cut corners. It's more often shaped by context or reinforcement history, unclear supervision, or even organizational norms. Sometimes the cause is internal to the RBT, like skill gaps, misunderstanding the code. But more often, the cause is external. It's about the supervisory environment, the feedback systems, or even in the organizational culture. So in this section, we're going to look at 5 of the most common causes of drift, pair them with examples that we see in the field. And you're going to be able to connect them to your own practice as well and start seeing where your systems might be unintentionally supporting drift also. So this is a really big one. RBTs are more likely to maintain ethical behavior when it's consistently reinforced. But Sellers et al. In 2016 points out that ethical actions like following procedures or asking for help don't always get attention. What does get reinforced? If we don't build the systems that reinforce ethical behavior, we accidentally shape drift. So here's what that can look like. It can look like smooth sessions, quiet clients, caregiver praise, session completion. If we're only acknowledging calm sessions and overlook fidelity of the treatment that we've asked to be implemented, we teach our RBTs, again, accidentally, that drift is more valuable than fidelity. So we really have to be mindful of what we're saying and how we're saying it in our supervision, what we're highlighting to be the important things that we're noticing that they're doing or not. So for example, an RBT consistently skips the last step of a hygiene routine to avoid triggering a tantrum. The caregiver praises the RBT for a smooth session. The BCBA later observes that, but says nothing. The drift becomes unintentionally reinforced. It wasn't addressed. So in your current supervision, what gets more attention, do you think? The fidelity or the smooth outcomes? Take that moment. It's not always easy to look at this and answer a question like this, but it's super important and super fruitful. And again, when we can acknowledge where those barriers and breakdowns are, it gives us the power to fix it, which is what we're all here for. So according to Kranak et al. In 2023, one major problem in supervision systems is that expectations are inconsistent or unclear, infrequent, delayed, or vague. When RBTs aren't sure what's expected or they aren't given timely feedback, they start to improvise. This creates conditions where RBTs fill in the gaps with their best guess or follow whatever gives the fastest feedback. And we might think that we're being clear, but inconsistency across supervisors or feedback styles or documentation opens the door to that ambiguity. So this can happen when the BCBA is just stretched too thin. Observations are irregular, feedback is general instead of specific, expectations shift based on who's watching. Drift thrives when supervision lacks precision. So we need explicit expectations, clear boundaries, and timely feedback. These are important things in our supervision. So an example here of how this might look. A BCBA praises an RBT for solid data collection, not realizing that the data reflect a shortcut taken during prompting. The RBT hasn't directly observed the session, and the RBT assumes that what they were doing is fine. So take that moment to uncomfortably reflect. Are your supervision systems reliable and precise, or do they kind of shift into that reactive and inconsistent side? And again, it's not bad or wrong if it is that reactive and inconsistent side of things. We're all human, and we know that there's high burnout and overworkness in our field. But let's take a look at it, and when we can see it, that gives us power to do something about it, which is what we're all about. All right. So delegation drift comes from a well-meaning but misinformed team member, teacher, OT, parent, somebody other than our ABA team, giving alternate directions that conflict with the behavior plan. And then our RBTs are right there in the middle of it, stuck. They frequently get caught between team members, between teachers, parents, therapists, all of whom might ask them to change course or change something different about what the treatment is suggesting. They don't want to upset a parent or disrupt the team harmony. So the RBT defaults to the most immediate instruction, especially when they don't feel supported potentially by their supervisor. And to make it difficult, when a BCBA isn't present or doesn't provide a strong enough system for handling these moments, our RBTs default to whoever's the closest or the most persuasive. Again, human. We are all human. This can lead, though, to those unintentional ethical violations. Remember, proximity often wins over hierarchy. Whoever's in the room becomes the de facto supervisor if we're not visible and clear right there, which we know that we can't be all the time. That's just not how our treatment systems are set up. So for example of what this can look like, a parent tells the RBT, don't use that token board today, just give him the candy when he asks. The RBT complies because they don't want to upset the parent. And you only find out a week later in a check-in about it. You find out, but it is at that delay, right? So take for a moment to think about your supervision. Do your RBTs know what to do when they receive competing instructions? Is this something that you've talked about in your supervision before? We gotta train that. We can't expect that we can't expect that they know what to do in these situations unless we've talked about it and trained it. Sometimes too, drift happens because the plan isn't concrete enough. Sometimes drift is caused by poor materials or poor ethics, not poor ethics. If the treatment plan is missing details like the prompting hierarchy or the criteria for reinforcement, our RBTs are left to interpret what to do. And this can show up in a number of places. For example, but not limited to, not having clear response definitions, unclear prompting hierarchies, reinforcement schedules missing details, inadequate visuals or training materials. Donovan et al. In 2019 found that unclear programming increases burnout and can lead to errors in implementation. Unclear procedures increase RBT stress and burnout, which then increases drift. So an example of this could look like an RBT reads the plan and sees reinforce appropriate behavior immediately. But there's no definition of what appropriately includes or how much reinforcement to deliver. So they guess, and the procedure is now off track. I want you to ask yourself, what would happen if you gave your plan to a brand new RBT? Do you think that they could follow it without any help? When we write our plans, think technological, one of our 7 dimensions. It is so important that we're writing with enough detail, important detail, that someone could pick it up and implement it without us having to walk them through it and teach it. That's how we want to be writing our plans, with enough thorough detail. Now, this one is a little bit harder to see, but it might be the most powerful. One of the toughest but most important causes to confront is culture. Britton et al. In 2021 talk about soft systems failure. When organizations normalize drift because there's no pushback. Maybe the team prioritizes client satisfaction over plan fidelity. Maybe the clinic celebrates flexibility without protecting scope. When our RBTs are praised for improvising but never corrected for scope violations, drift becomes embedded in the culture. It becomes a default, and ethical action becomes the outlier. As supervisors, we have the power to shift this, not necessarily overnight, but through consistent modeling, feedback, and structure. So an example of this could look like an RBT creates their own token system for a client mid-session with no plan changes or consultation with the BCBA. Seems to work, and the team says, oh, your cells are great, self-starter. Over time, though, this becomes the expectation. The RBT is expected to make these, winging decisions and creating these materials in a vacuum without consulting with the prescribing BCBA. So when you think about your own supervision, what's reinforced more in your setting? Creativity or fidelity? Again, it's a hard pill to swallow to look at our own supervision practices, but that's where we are able to make the change and know that we are moving to a more ethical place. So kudos to you for doing it. We're going to keep zooming out now and look at how this typically unfolds over time. First, we have initiation. The RBT makes a small change to avoid discomfort. Then it's reinforced. The session is smoother, the parent or team gives positive feedback, followed by consolidation. A new pattern is repeated. And then normalization. The BCBA doesn't catch it or quietly accepts it. And finally, impact. The plan loses fidelity, the client's progress slows. This timeline helps us see how small acts of drift become systemically reinforced. If you wait too long to identify the cause, you're correcting a habit, not a mistake anymore. So let's turn our lens inward for a moment. As a BCBA, your reinforcement history, supervision style, and cultural modeling all shapes the conditions under which ethical drift either survives or fades. So you're not just correcting behavior, you're designing a system that means your own patterns matter too. So I want you to take a simple moment to ask yourself, do I give more praise for calm sessions than accurate ones? How quickly do I respond when drift is observed? How do my RBTs feel safe asking me when they're unsure? Do they feel safe? Do I reinforce problem-solving conversations or just correct missteps in my supervision? This is where supervision becomes transformational. It's not about catching mistakes. It's about creating the conditions where ethical behavior is clear, reinforced, and easier to choose. So if you had to think back, which of these drift causes show up in your current supervision most often? What's one step that you can take this week to shift the reinforcement contingencies in your system? Now, it would be great for us to think that none of this ever happens to us individually, but the fact of the matter is, all of it happens to us to a degree. So I challenge you to look at where you're seeing this in your practice and take that moment to think about, okay, what am I going to do after I stop and see it? So now that we've identified the cause, we can move to replacing drift with direction. How to explicitly teach, model, and reinforce ethical behavior within your supervision system. We've spotted the drift. We've traced the cause. Now it's time to show them where to go instead. This step is all about setting the ethical standard clearly, behaviorally, and proactively. Ethical practice can't live in the abstract. It needs to be taught. It needs to be modeled, rehearsed, and reinforced, just like every other skill that we ask our RBTs to perform. Research backs this up, y'all. Kranick et al. In 2023 and Sellers et al. In 2016 remind us that supervision isn't just oversight, it's a behavior change process. That means that when an RBT responds ethically under pressure, it's not an accident. It's because someone taught them how to do that. Let's talk about what that looks like in practice. We've all said it. Stay in your scope. Follow the code. But what do these words mean when a parent is pressuring an RBT to just try something, or when a team member contradicts a plan? Saying, don't cross the line, isn't enough if no one's told them where that line is. That's why your teaching as a supervisor needs to be behavioral, contextual, and ongoing. A new RBT is told, stay in scope, but isn't sure what that includes. Later that week, the parent asks for help with toileting, and the RBT gives suggestions based on what they've seen on past cases. So instead of being vague with stay in scope, we could offer more specific examples of what that means. For example, here's what staying in scope looks like. If a parent asks for advice, you could say, that's a great question. I'll talk to my supervisor and make sure that we figure out a plan to address it the right way. Even better than just explaining it, role play it during training so that the phrase feels fluent. We can come up with these awesome suggestions of how they could respond to different situations, but if it doesn't feel comfortable and natural for them to say it through practice, they're not going to say it. So make sure that we're practicing these things too. When is the last time that you explicitly defined ethical expectations for your RBT in behavioral terms? How often are you having these conversations in your supervision? If you're not, it's good that you're seeing it. It challenges us to help move our practice towards that ethical side of things, which is why we're here, right? So teaching is powerful, but how you behave when things get tricky, that teaches more than any handout ever could. Modeling isn't about being perfect. It's about showing what ethical behavior looks like in real time, especially under pressure. Sellers et al. In 2016 say that supervisors have a responsibility not to just instruct, but to demonstrate ethical conduct. So this is going to include how to set boundaries, how to respond when someone pushes those boundaries, how to document ethically and not just legally, and how to handle feedback or mistakes. All of these things don't come naturally to most of us and require being taught. So, I empower you to empower your RBT to learn these practices, learn these ethical practices, because that is how we can help our RBTs to become stronger professionals. So, for example, a parent emails the RBT asking about extinction strategies. The BCBA replies to the parent directly without looping in the RBT and explaining why it's out of scope. So the RBT now believes that this is norm. What could you do instead? Well, the BCBA replies with the RBT CC'd and says, "Thank you so much for your question. Since this touches on treatment planning, I'll take point and connect with you soon with a plan that RBT can help carry out." So later then in supervision, you touch base with your RBT about it. "Hey, I CC'd you on that email so that you could see how I handled it." It's a great example of how we can protect scope while staying collaborative. It's important that everybody's feedback gets involved that has a hand in treatment, because we all need to be aligned in our treatment. But these examples are how you can turn moments into mentorship. So you're also showing an investment in your RBT to help their professional growth, which is going to feel good to them and make them want to invest back into you and the work that you're doing. So can you think about one recent moment that you could have used the model, used an opportunity to model effective behavior and didn't? What was happening? What was going on for you? What could have been going on for the RBT? Again, just take the moment to look at it. It's okay. When we see things, we then have the power to change those things if they don't work. So if we want our RBTs to act ethically when it's hard, for example, when a parent's upset or a team member disagrees, they need more than just a rule book. They need practice. Donovan et al. In 2019 showed us that RBTs with opportunities to rehearse difficult conversations were more confident, more consistent, and less likely to burn out. So research is even telling us that this is so important that we are practicing and rehearsing these skills that we want to be teaching our RBTs. So you're supervising a session and a parent says to the RBT, "Don't use that token board. It's too robotic." Your RBT freezes. Instead of debriefing later, in that moment, you could turn to your RBT. "Hey, RBT, let's pause. Imagine the parent just said that. What could you say that keeps you in scope but shows empathy?" And try it. Okay, we can skip it. You say, "Well, thanks for trying. Let's build that response." Maybe we could try saying, "Thank you for that feedback. I'll talk to my supervisor so that we can adjust the plan together." So now we've given the RBT a script, not just a memory of freezing. So we've given them that teachable opportunity in the moment, which is important. Just like we ask for our clients to take advantage of all those teachable opportunities, we're doing that the same as in our supervision with our RBTs. So ask yourself, are you giving your RBTs a chance to practice how they'll respond under pressure? Make sure that maybe you're role playing that you're the disgruntled parent and they're the RBT in the moment. What does it feel like to have those emotions, have that feedback, whatever's going on, have that pressure present, and what do they do with it? So we've taught, we've modeled, we've rehearsed. Now comes the real question. Did it transfer? Kranick et al. In 2023 highlight that observing transfer of learning is a critical skill in effective supervision. Here's what it can look like in practice. Ask your RBTs to teach back how they'd respond, or observe for fluency, not just compliance. Check for scope-consistent phrasing during caregiver interactions and reinforce ethical choices even when they're awkward or clunky. After teaching scope scripts, for example, you could say to your RBT, let's say that a parent asks if the new behavior could be trauma-related. What would you say? Or how would you know that's in or out of your scope. If you notice that your RBT's answer to a question like that is shaky, it's not failure. It's a teaching opportunity. We again here have another opportunity of a teachable moment to help shape their behavior and shape their understanding and reinforce their ethical practice. So we've talked through a lot already. We're about halfway through our training. So think about, what systems do you have in place to assess whether ethical teaching has actually transferred into performance? Can you see anything in your own practice that fits this bill? Or do we need to look a little bit closer at what we can add? Because here's the truth. Ethical behavior doesn't live in a code. It lives in what we teach, what we model, and what we reinforce. When we treat ethical behavior like we treat program implementation, with clear expectations, modeling, practice, and performance feedback, we have a chance to give our RBTs the tools to do better before mistakes happen. This is how we move from reactive correction to proactive transformation in our supervision. And your job isn't just to stop drift, it's to build fluency. So think about it too. What part of your system, your supervision system, could you make more explicit, more behavioral, or more practice-based this week? Think about these things that we've already talked about. What are you going to put in action? What kind of rings that bell for you of, oh man, let me give that a try. I think that I really need that. I hope there's something. All right, so we have taught this skill. We've modeled what it looks like. We've practiced it together. But even our best trained RBT can't sustain ethical behavior in an environment that punishes it. That's why this step is all about shaping the systems around your RBTs so that ethical behavior isn't just possible, it's preferred. Because here's the truth. RBTs don't drift because they don't care. They drift when the environment rewards speed over accuracy, or silence over questions, or convenience over protocol. Sellers et al. In 2016 and Saunders 2023 both emphasize that if you want ethical behavior to stick, your environment has to support it consistently. So let's look at how that plays out. Start here. What contingencies are actually in place? Are calm sessions praised more than accurate ones? Do caregivers express frustration when RBTs follow plans too rigidly? Are staff rewarded for improvising even when it deviates from the protocol? If so, drift might not be an accident. It might be a reinforced pattern. So your job isn't just to monitor progress and performance, it's to shape the conditions that support ethical behavior even when it's slower, harder, or less popular. All right, so in our scenario, a caregiver says, you don't really need to track that every time, right? The RBT smiles, nods, and drops the data sheet for the rest of the session. The session runs smoothly, no one notices that the data is even missing. So what do you do here? One thing that you could try is addressing both the RBT and the caregiver together. We always track that behavior, even if it's low frequency, because it helps us understand trends and catch changes early. So you've got your caregivers being coached to support fidelity, not undermine it, and your RBT is praised during supervision for maintaining accuracy under pressure. Think about it. What systems in your setting might accidentally reinforce drift? They're probably there, so can you see them? Now, even one unclear voice can shake an RBT's confidence. When caregivers or team members get mixed messages, it puts the RBT in a bind. Do they follow the plan or the person? Your job is to create a culture of clarity where scope is respected, the plan is the anchor, and the RBT knows how to respond to pushback. That means that coaching caregivers on your ethical supervision process is important. And helping RBTs script polite but firm boundary statements is also important. So you've got a school staff member telling your RBT, just prompt him less today. He's tired. The RBT reduces the prompting, and the BCBA finds out a week later via the data. So what could you do here? In your training, as you're kind of role playing and practicing different situations and scenarios that might come up with your RBT, You could teach your RBT to say something like this. Thanks, I'll let my supervisor know that you have a concern so that we can make a plan together. And the BCBA follows up with that staff then. Hey, thanks for looking out for our learner. It's so important that we're meeting him where he's at. When there's a concern, have him bring it to me so that we can adjust in a way that fits our plan. These are ways that you can think about how to align everybody's behavior together, not just the RBTs, because it's not just going to the RBT and fixing that route of the communication. We also want to support our RBT by wrapping around and supporting the communication with the other team members also. So in your practice, are caregivers or staff sending messages that contradict your plan? It happens. It's happened on almost every case that I've been on. How do we reshape these contingencies? That's the thing to be thinking about, especially when you have that, maybe it's that situation that comes up that in the back of your mind, it's like red flag, red flag, red flag. Those are the ones we want to be addressing and to figure out how to make ourselves comfortable too, to support our RBTs when things like this happen. Now, let's be honest for a moment. Do your RBTs feel safe telling you when something's off? Drift is often unspoken, not because it's malicious, but because it's invisible, uncomfortable, and unrewarded. When our RBTs hide confusion, it's usually a signal of the system that punishes uncertainty. So we want to start reinforcing any reporting, any bringing up those conversations, reinforce the questions, reinforce the I'm not sures. We want our RBTs to know that it's not about being perfect or quiet. It's about communicating and working together. And sometimes that can be not pretty or uncomfortable. So we've got a scenario here. An RBT says during session, I realize that I've been using the wrong reinforcer for the past week. What do you do? Well, you could respond with criticism, or you could say, hey, I really appreciate you being honest. Let's fix it together and talk about how to track that moving forward. Everybody makes mistakes. Thanks for noticing it. Thanks for owning up to it. That is the important piece of it. We are all human. None of us are perfect and we all make mistakes. So when we can help our RBTs to see that and that it's not a you're in trouble type conversation, you're more likely to see them do that in the future, where they may come to us with a, hey, I messed up, or a, hey, I'm not certain about this, even though it's uncomfortable. So again, ask yourself, what does your environment really teach about mistakes? Would your RBT say that it's safe to be unsure about things? If you are in a larger system, do you feel safe being unsure about things when it comes to your supervisors or higher ups? Because again, we've been talking about how this is an environment thing, a systems thing. And when these feelings of safety aren't present, it really gives us the opportunity to look at our environment and our system and see what things we can modify. Finally, I want you to ask yourself, are the systems that you've built sustainable for your RBTs? Ethical behavior shouldn't require heroics. If your systems require RBTs to fight for fidelity on their own, the environment needs a redesign. We want to look for clear, quick access to supports, consistent supervision with feedback, easy documentation tools, and time and space to debrief tough moments. These are important in supervision, and oftentimes they're hard to come by. There's so much going on in a given session, and we've got the demands of our clients, the demands of the team, the data, the everything. Like, we're no stranger to how busy and complex our sessions can be a lot of times. But these pieces in supervision are so important because that's where we're able to support our RBT to stay ethical. So we always want to be asking ourselves, is my system designed for drift or for durable ethical behavior? Every so often, you got to be asking yourself, you got to be reflecting on your own supervision practices and think about what's being reinforced? How is it being reinforced? Are you creating the space for your RBT in your supervision? All right, we have done the heavy lifting. We have spotted subtle ethical drift. We have traced it back to the systems that's driving it. We have established clear standards and reshaped the environment to support them. Now comes the most underused but most important part: reinforcement and recalibration. Because even with training, even with modeling, even with environmental alignment, things shift. Not because of failure, because we're humans. Teams evolve, clients change, new barriers emerge. So the ethical behavior that we teach and reinforce must evolve too. That's what this step is about: maintaining momentum through feedback and reflection. It's not glamorous, but it's how we build ethical behavior that actually lasts. So let's be honest. How often do we treat ethics like a crisis response? Something we only talk about when something goes wrong? But if we want ethical behavior to be resilient, we have to reinforce it proactively, not just after mistakes, not just when we're doing damage control. This means actively noticing and reinforcing things like staying in scope when it would have been easier to give in, reporting uncertainty early before it becomes a violation, or upholding fidelity even when the parents' pushback is making them uncomfortable, or asking questions that signal ethical thinking. Saunders in 2023 is very clear in their research. These micro moments are where ethics is either shaped or eroded. And it is our job to treat those micro moments as opportunities. So let's look at this example. An RBT hesitantly admits during supervision, "I realized I was prompting the wrong step, but I wasn't sure, so I just finished the session that way." What do you do if this were to happen? Well, as a supervisor, you might say, "Just review the protocol again next time." Or you could have taken this training, learned some new strategies, and tried this. Thank you for telling me that. It shows that you are watching your own behavior and thinking critically. I like that. That's what supervision is for. Let's walk through these steps again, and we'll flag this as something to add to your visuals. And then you follow up in supervision the next week. So we adjusted the prompting beautifully in that session. I could tell that you double checked. Great job staying flexible and accountable. So practices like this are how ethical behavior becomes sustainable, not just correction, but from shaping. So we're noticing the error. We are diving into it, setting up a support, and then using that support to create the consistency of the ethical behavior and following it up. So it's not just here, do this, and then never revisit it again. You've got here, do this. Okay, let's figure out how that worked. Did it work? And continue looking at it. So when you think about your own practice, are you reinforcing the behavior of ethical thinking or just the absence of mistakes? Because they're different. Yeah, it's great not to have mistakes, but it's more important that we're looking at ethically thinking or reflecting on our own behavior and if that's in alignment or not with our treatment. Here can be where many supervisors stumble. We can assume that drift means someone wasn't listening or isn't trying. But in reality, drift usually means that the system's changed, a barrier emerged, or the environment rewarded something else. So we got to think about that and look at those as possibilities. This is why recalibration is supervision's best friend. Britton et al. In 2021 emphasized that the most preventable ethics violations are the ones that supervisor never circled back on. Not out of neglect, but out of busyness, burnout, or the assumption that we already covered that. So we can think of recalibration like tuning an instrument. The more consistently you do it, the smoother the music. But if you wait too long, the best player in the world will still sound off. So again, we can't put out there, here, do this, and never follow up on it again. It's not going to make the change that we want. We've got to constantly stay tuned and jump in and out of different conversations to revisit them again as we are able to assess their fidelity and consistency as well. So we've got an example here. You're reviewing a video from a recent session and notice that your RBT used a modified prompting strategy. Not harmful, but not in the plan. What do you do? Instead of just correcting it silently, you could go talk to your RBT. Hey, I noticed you changed the prompt here. Can you walk me through what led to that? Let them have the opportunity to explain, because you may hear something you weren't expecting. For example, they could explain that the original prompt felt intrusive with the client, and it helps you to realize that the plan needs adjusting. These are the times we say to our RBTs, thank you for adjusting thoughtfully. Now let's bring that into our next plan review together so we can tighten up the procedure. This recalibration done right invites partnership and not shame towards our RBTs. They have really good ideas, you guys. I love hearing the ideas that my RBTs have and figure out how we can use their insight and feedback, because they're boots on the ground. They're right there all the time. They've got really great feedback and oversight of what's going on with the client in session. And I want to be able to use that. I don't want them to have to feel like they have to use it on their own. We're together. We work as a team to create treatment and implement effective treatment with our clients. So I want you to ask yourself, when was the last time that you recalibrated a procedure before it became a problem? Did you notice something? Did your RBT notice something? Did they bring it to you? Did you work on this together to address it? Those are the things I want you to be thinking about. So you've probably heard this before. Supervision should be ongoing. Well, yeah, it sounds great, right? But what does it actually look like? Ongoing supervision looks like a feedback loop embedded into your week, your month, your system. These feedback loops are the pulse check for ethical behavior. They allow you to catch drift early, reinforce integrity in real time, revisit tough situations while they're still fresh, and keep your team clear, confident, and aligned. Donovan et al. In 2019 show that supervision systems with built-in reflection protect us against burnout and increase staff satisfaction. Why? Because they don't rely on memory or emotion. They rely on structure. So when feedback becomes part of your routine, so does ethical reflection. I want you to try some of these strategies. Ethics minutes during team meetings. A drift watch note on your supervision form. Have it there prompting you to ask about it or to be thinking about it or to watch for it. Maybe it's a standing question. What's something that felt off this week that you talk about with your RBT and supervision? Or an end of the session debrief. Was there a moment you felt unsure today? Whether you saw that they were unsure or not, it gives them the opportunity to bring it up and talk through something that they might need more support with. Maybe ask yourself, where in your weekly structure can you embed feedback about ethical performance? Is it in a meeting? Is it in a session? Is it in a routine email, letter, text conversation with your RBTs? Where are you creating this opportunity for ethical reflection on behavior? Now let's close the loop together. Supervision isn't a checkbox. It's not a form. It's not a once a week meeting. It's a living, evolving relationship where you shape ethical repertoires, build confidence, and create clarity. Ethical behavior doesn't survive in ambiguity. It survives in consistency. It grows in environments where RBTs feel safe, clear, and supported. What you're doing, it's more than compliance. It's culture building. And that's how we prevent drift, protect our clients, and support our staff long term. Not just reacting, but by making sure we are constantly working towards these things with them. What's one thing that you can reinforce and one system that you can revisit in your supervision practice? I want you to be thinking about that and how we can use some of this feedback and strategies to help. So we've just walked through a supervision system that doesn't just correct. It prevents, teaches, and sustains. So let's review what you now have in place. Catch the drift. You now know how to spot subtle ethical missteps before they become violations. You can name them, decode them, and interrupt them. Locate the cause. You can look past surface level behavior to see the reinforcement system and supervision gaps that are driving these drifts. Establish the standard. You've learned how to replace ambiguity with clarity and how to model, teach, and rehearse ethical behavior so that your RBTs can actually do it. Align the environment. You know how to shape the world around your RBTs so that doing the right thing isn't just possible, it's reinforced. And reinforce and recalibrate. You now have a system for sustaining performance over time, catching wins, addressing change, and building long-term ethical fluency. That's the CLEAR framework. And it's not just a course. It's a mindset shift in how we supervise. So let me leave you with this. Think back to someone who supervised you early on. Were they kind, distant? Did they explain their thinking? Did you feel safe telling them when you didn't know something? Did they model how to navigate hard conversations or avoid them? We all remember the supervisor that made us feel small, but we also remember the one who made us feel safe, who shaped our voice, who saw our uncertainty as curiosity, who helped us grow, not because they had to, but because they knew what was at stake. That's the kind of supervisor that you're becoming. And every time you make drift visible, every time you debrief without shame, every time you reinforce honesty over perfection, you are becoming the supervisor that someone will remember for the right reasons. Now that you've learned the framework, it's time to use it. You don't need to overhaul everything. Just pick one step to start with this week. Maybe you try a new rehearsal scenario. Maybe you start reinforcing reporting more actively. Maybe you review stakeholder messaging with your team. Start small, stay consistent, and come back to the framework when things feel unclear. Ethical supervision isn't about being perfect. It's about staying aligned, even when the path gets messy. Everything you've learned in this course comes with built-in support. So use your workbook and the additional tools that are provided to help you put this plan into action. But let's be real, you might hit some resistance too. Maybe a caregiver doesn't like it when you hold the line. Maybe your RBTs are afraid of being corrected. Maybe you feel stretched too thin to build a new system. All of that is real. And here's your move. Don't blame, don't freeze, don't quit. Go back to the drift. Ask, what's being reinforced here? Use the tools, reteach the standards, align the system. And most importantly, reinforce the effort. This isn't about perfection. It's about ethical endurance. All right, before we close, I want to walk with you through one more final applied example. Now, throughout this training, we've talked about ethical drift, how it develops quietly, how it often goes unnoticed, and how it rarely starts as an obvious violation. What I want to focus on here is how ethical supervision moves from awareness to action. Because knowing what ethical drift looks like isn't enough if we don't have the systems that are going to help us respond clearly and consistently when it does show up. Now, this isn't about adding more rules or memorizing more code language. It's about making ethical supervision more sustainable in the environments where we actually work in and spend all of our time in practice. Ethical responsibility doesn't live in a tent alone. It lives in systems. Ethical drift is most likely when supervision relies on memory, impressions, or a sense of nothing feels wrong. Especially when we're supervising remotely across multiple settings or with a large caseload like most of the field has. A lot can happen between observations, you guys. I'm sure you get that feel too. Now, when supervision lacks structure, even strong supervisors are left relying on intuition instead of evidence. That's not an ethical failure. It's a systems gap. Ethical supervision becomes more reliable when we design systems that make behavior visible and reviewable instead of assumed. So let's look at a brief scenario here. You supervise an experienced RBT. Your sessions appear calm. Caregiver feedback is positive. The data suggests progress. Nothing about the case feels urgent or concerning. Then you get to a supervision session, and during the observation, you start to notice some subtle shifts. Prompts are being skipped. Parent questions are being answered in ways that go beyond the plan. Some procedures look a little bit different than what was originally designed that you had talked about and trained with your RBT. There's no clear ethics violations here. The RBT is well-intentioned. The family is happy. The client's making progress. But you feel that quiet sense of discomfort that seems the sense that things are slowly drifting away. So the ethical question here isn't who did something wrong. It's how confident am I in what I can observe, document, and address right now. So if you had to write a supervision note about this moment, about how you're feeling about this supervision and what you're seeing in this supervision, what would you actually say? What would you write? Is there a system that you use to consistently document your notes and your feedback to your RBT? Or do you wing it in the moment? Are there certain conversations that you set up with your RBT, ways that you reflect observations or consistency in the way that you make sure to follow up with your RBT when you've had a meeting? All these things are good and well when you have the documentation for them also, but how are you following up? How are you making sure that the feedback gets back to your RBT and there's a conversation? Because that is just as important, if not more, than the documentation that you're tracking from the supervision session. This is where ethical conduct and supervision really lives. Ethical conduct isn't about catching mistakes. It's about making ethical behavior visible enough to support it, especially around scope and fidelity and decision-making under pressure. Now, in my own supervision practice, I've spent many years trying to find the systems that are consistent for me, that prompt me to ask the questions in supervision or remind me to share the feedback or reflect the feedback to the supervisee. I've had many a templates, I've had many a checklists, and what I am currently using, what I've developed to meet my needs for that is the Ascend RBT assessment system. No, I rely on this structured assessment instead of impression and things that I remember. So the ethical conduct domain within the Ascend RBT assessment system focuses specifically on things related to what we've talked about today. Things like staying within scope, following clinical direction, and reporting uncertainty before it becomes drift. Now, I'm not sharing this with you as something you need to use, but as an example of how structure changes the conversation. I now feel more confident in the supervisions that I have with my folks because I've got documentation of what we've talked about and what we've reviewed. It is open, it's a feedback conversation, a feedback loop that connects us both to, the grounded values of the important pieces of RBT supervision and how we can help them develop to be the best RBTs that they can in alignment with the ethics and how to work with families and how to help our clients succeed. It moves supervision from that something feels off feeling to here's what we're seeing, here's what we're reinforcing, and here's what we're adjusting. Now, if you'd like more information on the Ascend RBT assessment, feel free to check out my website, www.elevateyourabasupervision.com. When ethical behavior is observable, you guys, feedback becomes clearer. Corrective conversations feel less personal, and supervisors are better protected in their own decision making. If any questions came up for you during this course, or if you're running into tricky supervision situations, I'd love to keep the conversation going. So here's what you could do. Drop a comment or question in the discussion section. or reach out via email. You can always reach me at support@elevateyourabasupervision.com. I want you to use this training as a resource to share with others in your system to make supervision better all around. To have others there to help you notice drift when it occurs and to overall make the system as strong as it can be. To receive your CEU, be sure to complete the quiz. Now, this quiz is going to be reflective of the course content that we have talked about in our training. So it's not as much about how much ethics you know, but how do you apply what we've talked about and how do you use it to make your own supervision more ethical? Then you're going to complete the CEU form, and when you get your certificate and your email, don't forget to keep it for your records. Make sure that your name and your BACB number are included when you submit everything, and make sure it's accurate too. I want to thank you for taking the time to grow your supervision skill set. You've just done something that matters for your team, for your clients, and for our field. Because when supervision gets better, when it gets more ethical, our outcomes get better too. And that is really what we're here for. So keep supervising clearly, keep modeling what matters, and keep being the supervisor that someone's going to remember. I'll see you in the next training.